November's election, aside from the race for president, are a lot of other very important races. There are, of course, 33 United States Senate races. All of the House of Representatives seats are up for election, and numerous state house seats in the 50 states are also up for election. Let's talk about those now. Turning to some other election issues, we don't have just one election. It's election day. There are a series of elections. There are 33 United States Senate seats up for grabs. There are also every United States House seat is up. I want to touch on, ask you, both of you, to kind of discuss some key races that are out there in Congress, both the United States House of Representatives and the United States Senate. Why don't you talk a little bit about maybe one or two races you're following in the U.S. Senate, the U.S. House, and Jonathan, I'll start with you.
Yeah, in New York, we're really firmly in Democratic control, and there's nothing really too much of a swing vote in terms of the congressional races in the state. But however, on the more global scale in the Northeast, a lot of the attention is focusing on the Sue Collins race in Maine for the state Senate. Collins was first elected in '96, and she has a strong challenger on her hands from the Speaker of the House of Representatives there. And when she was reelected in 2014, she received almost 70% of the vote. The most recent polls show Collins actually trailing by 5 votes. So that's something that I think the Republican GOP is really trying to get their head around and firm up the vote. Her race is going to be impacted dramatically by the Supreme Court nomination that's going to be coming up here in the next several weeks. And Sue Collins stated publicly that she does not support nominating the next Supreme Court justice before the November 3rd election. So that's a little bit of her breaking from the GOP and trying to shore up some undecided votes. But she's really in a tough position where no matter how she votes on the nominee, it's going to cause her some problems. But there's still some time to go, and Sue Collins has been doing this for over 20 years, and we don't want to count her out yet, but some of her votes under the Trump administration have isolated her and made her a little bit more vulnerable. So we expect that to be one of the main focuses of Senate races in the Northeast between now and Election Day.
Good. Any races you're following, Alexis, closely?
Yes, absolutely, both on the state and at the federal level. As I mentioned, Arizona's been traditionally a Republican state. Typically, the governor's been Republican, and typically the president of the Senate, with the exception of a few times in the last 50 years, and the Speaker of the House has always been Republican since 1965. So where are we today? We have a really different scenario. There's a very thin margin in the House of Representatives, and it's fairly likely that the next Speaker of the House will be a Democrat. There are 3 highly contested Senate seats, possible a coalition, probably not a Democratic majority, but it's possible that both of those houses will now be either a coalition or Democratic, making it really difficult for people to get legislation through that's pro-business, even with a Republican governor. It just won't happen. As he said, I was a moderator with him in an event recently, and he said, I may be using a lot of ink if that happens to veto bills, but it really puts the state behind because we haven't moved forward. So, and at the Senate level in Arizona, we have one of the most hotly contested U.S. senatorial races. We have Martha McSally up against Mark Kelly. Now, a little bit of history. During the last election, Kristen Sinema, who is our current U.S. Senator and is a Democrat, ran against Martha McSally. Martha McSally is a Navy fighter pilot, highly recognized in the military, and she ran a very close race with Kristen Sinema, but did not win, lost by a very slim majority. John McCain at the time was the senior U.S. Senator. he passed away. And when he passed away about 2 years ago, a little less than that, the governor appointed Martha McSally to complete his term, making her the incumbent, and hopefully, from his standpoint, assuring another Republican U.S. senator to replace John McCain. Well, that has not been as easy as it might seem. And she is in an election against a former astronaut, Mark Kelly. He was also married to a U.S. House of Representative member, a Democratic member, Gabby Gifford. And very sadly, there was a shooting. She was holding a coffee in Tucson for constituents, and there was a shooting, and she was seriously injured. She's alive, but physical and mental impairments were the result of that. So he has a broad base in the southern part of the state, and he's done a fairly good job with the business community in Phoenix, although they still, all of the endorsements, the chamber endorsements, all of them have been for Martha McSally. She has achieved a fair amount of legislation passed in her short tenure, but it's a really, really tight race. So that's when we're watching carefully. And as a result of that being such a popular vote, we've had President Trump here a couple of times. Both of his sons were here a week ago, and we're expecting him back again, depending on what happens with the coronavirus, but he's expected to come back in another couple of weeks. So that's Arizona. The other race that's also really fascinating to me is in Alabama, which is a Senator Doug Jones is, according to CNN poll, the most likely senator to lose in a re-election in a state where Trump won this state, Alabama, by 28 points in 2016. And part of the reason is he was elected in a special election in 2017. So he's only been in the Senate for 3 years, making him a bit more vulnerable. But he's also running against a prior Auburn University head football coach, the past head football coach, Tommy Tuberville, who is really liked. And if you know Alabama at all, or the Southern Conference, people live and breathe football there as they do across the country, but particularly there. So his name ID is just incredible. He's very well liked. So it's possible that both of those seats could go to a Democrat in the upcoming election.
Here in the Northeast, we're also paying close attention to the state that's in between you and I, the state of Pennsylvania there. And, that's a state where Biden comes from, and it's shifting a little bit more red. However, Philadelphia and the suburbs there seem to be going more in a blue direction. So I think that's another real close state that our international listeners should be paying a close attention to. That could be the modern day Florida of this election.
And let me mention one other thing that's going to be really, really critical in the southwestern states. Near us, we have geographically, we've got Colorado and New Mexico, which are Democratic, and Nevada recently is Democratic by 2.3 margin. And then we've got Utah, which is Republican, and California, which is Democratic. In that area, what's really going to be interesting, not so much in California, but particularly in Nevada and in Arizona, is going to be whether the young Latinos turn out to vote, because they, combined with the moderate Republicans or the independents, really helped Clinton in the last election. And Arizona even voted for Clinton, and it was because that those groups were really present. So there doesn't seem to have been as much organization by the Biden campaign of them until recently. I'd say in the last 30 days, they've really upped their game with respect to that. And I don't know, I think that Nevada is suffering the same issue of motivating them. I don't know how much that will play into it, but it could shift both Arizona and Nevada to go for Trump rather than Biden, depending on whether or not they're present. And also an interesting state is Utah. This is a heavy Republican state, and Mitt Romney is the U.S. Senator for them. Senator Romney has a big dislike for President Trump, and a lot of that stems from the religious tenets that the Mormons follow, and so as a result of that, he has really encouraged Mormons in Utah to think about either not voting Republican or not voting at all, instead of supporting a president who he feels has not well represented the country.
Very interesting. And Jonathan, you had mentioned Pennsylvania, and based on the fact that they can't, we're going to see, because of coronavirus, we're going to see a lot of mail-in ballots in Pennsylvania. You couple that with the fact, it's my understanding that in Pennsylvania, they can't even open the mail-in ballots until election day. Can't even arrange them, getting them ready to be fed into reading machines. That all can't start until election day. That's going to create a significant delay in a state that is very much up for grabs. And so I agree with your assessment that come November, and not really November 3rd, it might be the 5th or the 6th, all eyes are going to be on the state of Pennsylvania. That's a very, very good possibility.
And what about Ohio, Steve? You're right next door to it, and there's a lot of potential there.
Well, it looks like for Ohio, it still, in spite of the polls are right now showing that Vice President Biden has a slight lead in the polls. But what we have seen is that polls have consistently undercounted core Republican supporters. We saw this 2 years ago in the midterm election when we had the governor, secretary of state, auditor, attorney general, and treasurer all on the ballot. And in the governor's polling, the governor, the candidate for governor, the Republican candidate for governor, had actually been behind in the polls since July, and he won, as did every other Republican statewide candidate, with a rather comfortable margin. So the pollsters in Ohio have yet to prove that they can accurately assess where this state is going to go. And for that reason, it certainly appears that Donald Trump will win Ohio's electoral votes. It'll probably take a while. I think in a lot of states what we're going to see, because it looks like there are far more mail-in ballots being requested by those that typically support Democrats than those that typically support Republicans, is we could see Donald Trump ahead in terms of the provisional electoral count by midnight Arizona time, we'll say, and gradually that lead will diminish as more and more of the mail-in ballots are counted, and gradually the electoral votes in those states that where he's up for grabs will gravitate over to Biden. The question is how much. And obviously what we'll have in the background, probably actually in the foreground, is the rhetoric coming from the Trump White House about whether or not the ballot casting process for mail-in ballots was fair, whether it's accurate, whether there's fraud. There's a good chance that we're going to see quite a bit of that, particularly if Trump is up immediately after Election Day. So looking at we've already touched a little bit on the state political environment. I'd like to talk a little bit about public policy in your states, and kind of look at what your state's priorities are right now and going into next year in terms of public policy. Jonathan, you talked a little bit about the budget and the fact that you have a deficit. What are some of the other issues that your governor will be working on?
You know, as the governor said previously, it's about the deficit. However, there have been some other issues that have taken center stage, and our legislature is currently waiting until the election or Congress comes up with a stimulus plan, and then we expect them to return here to Albany. But one of the issues that we've seen a lot of socioeconomic attention drawn to is just that the defund police and the anti-police movement. And we think that that's going to be something that will continue to drive policy within progressive groups downstate in New York City and Long Island, and grab a lot of the attention. So right now, we're just trying to make sure that we don't have to cut too many services, that we don't have to do too much additional borrowing or increase taxes that will lead to further population decline within our state. So it's really a fiscal outlook right now, but some of the social issues obviously do have an impact as well.
Is the defund police movement, does it have legislative support?
As our legislature moves more and more to the left and more progressive get elected to it, their voice becomes louder. We have done a series of police reform legislations at the state level, and we think that more of it could come if the issues continue to resonate across the country with some of these specific instances we've seen. So we're really taking a wait and see approach right now. And I think the election will determine how our conversation comes when our legislature typically returns in January for the start of the session, if not before that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know in our state that the Black Lives Matter movement and the defund the police movement appear not to be united. That there certainly is an awful lot of sympathy for the causes supported by the peaceful protesters earlier this year, the civil rights awareness that seemed to be piqued by the death of George Floyd. And it's on a bipartisan level. There's increased sensitivity about those types of issues and perspectives in the Ohio State House. But there is very little stated objective among elected officials on either side of the political aisle in the State House to defund the police. What about, go ahead, Jonathan. Yeah.
I was just going to say that New York is a very large and diverse state, and I think it depends on where the resident comes from with how that question gets answered. From the New York City region, we've seen the mayor of the New York scale back billions of dollars from the NYPD already, but those are limited circumstances, and we'll see what actual change that brings to it. Upstate and throughout Buffalo, Albany, Syracuse, it's a much more different conversation than it is within the 5 boroughs. But certainly the protests that we saw in June and July, some of those weren't peaceful in New York and caused some serious damage. So it's a very sensitive topic and seems to be changing daily, and what protection police are entitled to under state law could certainly be debated and possibly changed.
Alexis, what about in Arizona? Just kind of staying with this theme. Were there protests in Arizona, civil rights protests, and how were they received? And was there any bipartisan reception to at least part of the message?
Steve, there were protests and there were some serious issues. We had, initially they were the peaceful protests, and then you may have seen it made national news. One of our shopping areas, which is a very, very large mall, was absolutely ransacked, and it was destroyed, literally destroyed, in shops along the side, and the police actually, I don't know if it was intentional or not, but all of them were kept sort of in the mall until the morning with a fear, at least this is what I was told, that they might otherwise go into adjoining neighborhoods and the police wouldn't be able to control it. The governor got right on that, though, and immediately let it be known that he would pull out the National Guard. And so a few days later, several malls had National Guard tanks surrounding it. And the message was really clear. Peaceful protests were permitted. They continued in downtown Phoenix, but there was no more looting. He really put an end to that. I do think that during the session, there had been a bill moving very quickly with a lot of bipartisan support for criminal justice reform. The person who advanced that is in a very difficult race. It's unclear if he'll win, but hopefully that might come back this next session. We had to terminate our session early because of COVID, but what's really interesting, just in terms of our economy, and going back to that theme for a minute, Arizona is one of the few states that does not have a deficit. California, I think, has a 54 million deficit. We have $1 billion surplus. A year ago, Governor Ducey put $1 billion, brought it up to that. It was fairly high already. So during COVID, we did not, interestingly, even have to dip into that at all, because our economy had stayed fairly strong. And I think we're third strongest now in the country. But in terms of his legislative priorities, our governor's priorities, the first one's going to be to limit liability for businesses, nonprofits, schools, hospitals. There's a bill that was introduced at the federal level, and Mitch McConnell had said he was going to champion that and get it through. And somehow in the last phase, I think it gave way as part of the negotiations, but hopefully it will come back again if there's, I don't think it's a standalone bill, but could come back as another package. And in Arizona, the governor's bill, or one of the legislators who's working with the governor, mirrored pretty much Senator McConnell's bill. So that's going to be his top priority, I would say, is limiting liability because of the numerous lawsuits. Arizona has had all kinds of issues and has had to pass legislation in other areas to stop vexatious litigation. The other issue that's going to be important for him beyond the two of those is also he wants to pass a law to, or not pass a law, but get funds together to be able to equip all officers with body cameras. So I think we're going to see an increased discussion and focus on that from him in this next legislative session. He's already put it out there that it is one of his top priorities.
So I guess I have one final question for both of you regarding what we're dealing with, and it really has to do with the environment created by the coronavirus. And we're seeing a lot of changes in our society. We're seeing a lot of changes to the way governments are operating, businesses are operating, and a lot of that is going to change back. We're gonna see things go back to the way they were. We're going to see concerts come back. We'll all be able to go to concerts in the future, but there will be other things, I think, that won't quite go back. And I'd just be interested in your perspective about what is not going to go back. What permanent changes have we seen as a result of the changes that have been made in response to the coronavirus? Jonathan?
Well, I think one of the ways that government relations has been affected by this will have lasting impacts on our industry. Our state capitol has been closed to the public since mid-March, and lobbyists have not been able to enter the building. We've continued to do our job, and we've just kind of changed gears on the fly, if you will. And now it's a lot more virtual meetings such as these, phone conversations, instead of just camping outside of a member's office until you are able to track them down. So I think the role of technology has obviously accelerated a lot of this. But another impact that we've seen is just the changing regulations that's come out of our governor and legislature almost on a daily basis in the early days of COVID. And that's allowed the clients to really be able to rely on some of their government relations professionals and staff as we've tried to determine who's an essential worker and who is not an essential worker during all of this. And as the rules change differently based on capacity, whether it's 10%, 25, 50%, it's really important for us to stay at the forefront and be able to give instantaneous advice to our clients and have them impact the changing regulations. So it's really presented an opportunity for us to set our ourselves apart from others, and we welcome the challenge and continue to look forward to evolving with 2021.
Alexis, what are your thoughts about maybe a way we're going to have been changed and not go back?
Well, I think in some way, I agree with what Jonathan said. I think from a lobbying perspective, things have changed dramatically, but the majority of my calls are Zoom calls with members. But there are certain members who have insisted on in-person meetings, and it really is sort of an ethical dilemma. How do I best advance the interests of my client and not be there? Of course, I'm going to be there. But then the second level is when you have a member saying, hey, I can't hear you, take off that mask, who are you? Then it creates this, well, do I do that to make, to make sure that this meeting runs smoothly? So I would say, and that's been unusual. My meetings down there have been very infrequent, but it does raise those ethical issues. And I think what is also really important is that we have, in a way, less access to people, as Jonathan mentioned. So you have less of an opportunity to in person to communicate with them, read their body language, know where they stand on an issue. It's very difficult on a 30-minute Zoom call to know if that member is really with you. Whereas if you get a chance to bump into them in the hall the next day, you can find out if they've spoken to somebody else and they're still on the same page or not. So some of that aspect is, I feel, is very difficult. And in terms of law firms, the law industry, I think it is going to change significantly. It's already happening. We're the second largest law firm in Arizona, and we have 9 offices outside of the state. We now have a couple of offices in California, as well as the surrounding states, Colorado, Nevada. And what we're seeing happening, especially with the millennials, is they don't want to go back to the office. When they take polls, and older generation attorneys don't want to either. So it'll be interesting. Some studies say that people are more productive because they don't have the downtime of commuting and they can get to work right away and they can get more done. Others say no, that certain types of jobs really need to be managed in person. But I think that we're going to see, as a cost-cutting measure, a lot of law firms will probably look at reducing their footprint, large conference spaces available to meet with clients, and then smaller offices that you reserve if you need to go in and work in the office. I think that'll be the predominant direction, especially because that's what millennials already like, working at a coffee shop or outside. And as they come into more managerial positions, I think we may see more of that in the legal field.
Yeah, what's interesting about that, to piggyback on what you said, Alexis, is that it actually changes the way our local governments tax. It's had a huge ramifications on that. In Ohio, unlike in most states, our cities have income taxes. Well, they don't generally have property taxes. They have income taxes, which generally run about, I would say 2 to almost 3% of someone's gross income. And you're taxed where you work primarily, not where you live. Although some cities, like the one I live in, happen to also tax you where you live. And so there you end up paying a certain fraction of where the taxes where you work. Also in the jurisdiction where you live, there's a double taxation there. But what's interesting about that is that for a lot of my time working in 2020, I've not been working in the city where my office is located. I've been working at home. And that is going to create a very significant shift in the way that local governments get their money, particularly cities. But as you said, Alexis, I don't think we're going to go back entirely to office-based work environments and office-dominated work environments. There's going to be a lot of working from home. And so those revenues to the cities that have largely bet the farm on growing their revenues by attracting businesses within their boundaries, that's not a business model for cities that's going to work. They're going to actually have to focus more on a balance of attracting businesses and residents. And that means they're going to have to make sure that the resident experience is attractive, including improving their schools. So that is a change I think we're going to see in Ohio, just in the way that governments relate to businesses. Well, this has been a great conversation. Jonathan and Alexis, really appreciate sitting down and you sharing your insights with me and with all our viewers. And we look forward to seeing what results we get in the November election, whether those results come in November or December. But with that, I want to thank you and wish everyone a good day.
Look forward to seeing everyone at an in-person SCG conference sometime in the future.
That would be very, very nice. It would be Alexis's first conference, right?
And I'm looking forward to that, let me tell you.
And that concludes our recording. Thank you for joining us today. You can find this and many other episodes at scgglobalspin.com.